we believed that, or I still believe it, that market democracy is a fertile ground for growth, which may happen, doesn't have to happen. If it does, we should be grateful, use it wisely, for example, to solve things like this, etc., etc. What has, however, happened with, so you have the democratic capitalism, whatever our system is called, nobody's invented anything better so far, which could create growth. Again, here happened a subject-object reversal, and nowadays we believe something else. Reading newspapers, I think we believe that growth has become a conditio sine qua non of market democracy. In other words, deprive us of growth and markets will collapse. This is what you hear every day. Deprive us of growth and democracies will collapse, and most absurdly, deprive us of growth and peace will end in Europe and we'll go into shooting each other, which we've always done, and we've been very good at it. So this is the sort of, so it's not really a crisis of capitalism, although of course capitalism has many mistakes, many things that we need to repair, like cars, like iPhones, like everything that human beings ever created. To quote Nietzsche, everything is human, so human. And we thought that markets are not human, so human, but they are divine. There's again this fetish component that you may have experienced in your work. The regulators are stupid, the philosophers are stupid, the demonstrators are stupid. We understand the most, the market, but it is not really us, Peter, John, and Kelsey. It's something above us, the market, the pure fetish component, not the markets composed of people, but some sort of a weird superstructure which has all these magical powers. And we seek it for the very magical powers itself. How to defetishize it? Well, to realize that economics is just one of many wells that human beings should dwell on. And even the hypothesis that we had here yesterday, that well of happiness that we can take out of economics, and there is a lot of happiness that we can take out of economics, but my point is that that happiness is already drilled out. There's very little drops left there, but there are many other areas such as, I don't know what, friendship. Nobody talks about the crisis of friendship, love, art, education, talking about books, things like this. This is something that John Maynard Keynes also talks about in the economic possibilities of our grandchildren. He says, once we will be rich, affluent enough, and then economics will get to the place where it belongs, being a maintenance service. In other words, the building's already built. We no longer need an architect. We don't need priests to tell us what to do. We only need maintenance people to fix the leaking waters somewhere. And we could, and this is again quoting Keynes, we could devote our lives to things that really matter, such as the above.
Okay, let's, as you touched upon the priests, I think that is a good starting point to ask Joris to give his assessment of the cenacles of financial power that he dwells in the city of London, but you also went across to Frankfurt, for instance, as the European center of financial power. How do the priests behave? What do they believe in? And what does it teach us as mere humans?
So the idea of us versus them and them all being in it together, doing the same thing and knowing exactly what they're doing is false. And one of the fascinating things is that you don't really have to understand finance in order to function there. Often you don't have to understand the product in order to sell it. Often it's the product is built by a quant, a mathematical genius, and it's then it's sold on by someone in sales who has no idea. Then it's bought by someone who has no idea, and then it's people from compliance look at it, people from legal look at it, they have no idea either. And then there's another quant sitting here, and he says it's okay. And these quants often know each other from university because they're rather small groups of priests. For example, they're specialized in computational fluid dynamics. It's the behavior of air around a rocket. It's literally rocket science. And you can model markets, or so they claim, the same way. Air behaves the same way when you shoot up a rocket as markets, apparently. So these are a few hundred people. They all know each other. They haven't dated each other in university because they're all men. And I think
which
many of them
wouldn't necessarily exclude dating.
many of them are also still figuring out the girl thing, in the words of some of the people who have to take them out to get their commissions. But they share more with one another, even though they work for notionally competing banks, than they share with anyone else. There's a huge divide between quants and the rest, for example. Now, these are just a few examples of what happens when you actually look at something that is presented to you as a monolith, but it's actually a living organism. And it was just completely fantastic to read Tomáš Sedlácek's book, because you quote the Matrix, where people are in a cage that they can't smell, and they can't see, and they can't breathe. This is exactly what I find in my interviews. And many of the myths you identify, I hear back in a sort of updated or partially reconstructed fashion. And so these ideas of I'm contributing to progress. So I may be writing a very negative report about this country because they've just raised benefits. This is sort of, in the long run, it's better. It's for the better for us. I'm doing God's work in the name of Goldman Sachs CEO.
Goldman Sachs.
Yeah. And so I would really recommend reading Thomas's book. Of course, everyone who sits down in a session like this says, I would really recommend reading the other guy's book, because it's an easy thing to say.
Your book,
but it's really a good book.
The book that made you really famous, Joris, was the title was "Het zijn net mensen, they're just like people." That is more or less what you're saying now, not about Middle East people, but about the financial world in London. And that helps to explain or to understand better what is coming out of the city. Does it also help you to better identify where the real flaws are and what the real potentialities are of that financial world, where you can now see the differences, but that for the rest of the world still looks like a big blurb of homogeneity?
Well, one of the reasons I was looking forward to the session so much is that your question is really a question of where do you pitch your analysis. And so I think there are at least 3 levels where you can pitch the analysis. Where Thomas pitches his analysis at the top level is saying growth. That is an assumption underlying so much of the discourse. For example, a lost decade in Japan. Why was it lost? They didn't have growth. Did suicide rates go up? Did people have more friendships? It doesn't matter. They didn't have growth, so it was lost. So that's one level. Then the other level, where you may say things are going wrong, is with the use of credit. The idea that private banks, privately held banks, can essentially create money out of thin air. And they create it more and more and more. And so the idea was, the economy is doing so well that housing prices are going up. Increasingly, I meet people who say it's the other way around. The housing prices went up because there's a flaw in our system, and people withdrew money from that inflated housing asset, spend it, and then called the activity growth. That's why there's, especially in the UK, there's this panic, like, how do we rekindle growth? And they don't seem to see that the growth that they had was based on borrowing lots and lots of money. And then there was activity, and they said, that's us, that's what we're now entitled to. Our economy had this size once, so we should have it again. Let's, borrow even more money. Now from my grandchildren. No longer from foreigners, because they won't fall for it, just we print more money, more money. So that's the second level. Should we allow privately held banks to create money? Should we include rising housing prices in the inflation number? And then you can go even deeper. You can, one step, another level is money actually a product? Does free market theory apply to money? Because if more apples are eaten, the prices go up. And farmers decide to plant more apple trees, and you get more apples, and the market rebalances. But an asset is something really different. And often, if you see the price of apple go up, the share, actually people think, I'll get into on it, because we're in a rally. So it isn't self-balancing, it isn't self-correcting, it's actually self-defeating until you get another bust. Then there's a deeper level. If you say, okay, so we'll accept growth, we'll accept private credit creation, and we will accept the bank's role in it, then, and money is a product, then why isn't there a free market at the apex of the free market system? Because we just have a dozen of banks, we have 3 credit rating agencies, we have 4 big accountancy firms, we have a handful of financial firms, we have 2 major information distributors that also make a lot of money from the banks, Bloomberg and Reuters. That is not a free market. the cleaning lady in the bank, she is in a free market. She competes with others. If she wants the salary of a banker, people laugh at her. They just get another cleaning lady. If she cleans it as badly as the banks have been doing their work, she's fired. They'll just get another one. And if there's no company offering a good cleaning service, other companies will be founded and will be started up because it's quite easy to start a cleaning firm. That is the free market. You don't have that. We haven't seen a single new credit rating agency, single new accountancy firm, a single new investment bank. There is no self-correcting system at the top of the top of the system. They're just a cartel. They make a lot of money, and it pays. And so I'm coming back to your question. It pays for lots of things: PR, sponsoring, a recruitment circus in the universities. It also pays for a very nice package deal, so that when you're fired, you shut up.
And so we're stuck with a system that is basically dysfunctional, but that is being propped up by our governments. There is this big story, the narrative, the myth around the economy as it is or should be. Who comes up with that? How, or I'm not looking for the person, but the structure. Yeah. How does it get defined, reproduced?
It's the universities. It's absolutely universities. So
universities.
There are quite a few economics professors who are sort of your age, with all due respect, who came through the 70s and who believe in Bildung, the idea of self-development, education and self-development, and they just go completely nuts, both from the curriculum that's imposed on them and from the students they get, who view education purely as an obstacle course, and you just have to get over those obstacles, and so then you land your job. And they're talking about how sort of deeply impressionable, young, idealistic 18-year-olds come into LSE, Oxford, Cambridge, and they really want to know about economics, and they could be the next Thomas. 3 years later, they have one thing on their mind, it's like how to get into Goldman Sachs. And something has happened. And there is, I mean, I've spoken to professors who say, you know, the Scientology church, that's just Boy Scouts compared to what the banks are doing. They just take the most brilliant 18-year-olds and they put them into this psychosis where basically if you didn't get recruited by Goldman Sachs, somehow you failed. And it starts in the university, not only the textbooks they get, where there's just no ethics, or ethics is a 2 credit point little course tacked on somewhere, and then the recruitment center, the recruitment circus. And these things two together create these 21-year-olds. Then they go into the banks, they work 90 hours a day for many years. The first 2 years, the sort of number one offense is to raise any ethical issue. It's sort of the first thing you learn in terms of socialization.
The first rule of Fight Club is you do not talk about Fight Club. You know, the first rule of economics is you do not talk about ethics.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What we see in Europe is the German model where the discourse is you shouldn't get into debt. You should repay the debt by spending less on social care, on the social system. So austerity is the name of the game today, and not spending or public spending in order to create growth. But we still want growth.
Well, this is the American story versus the European story. Let me give one stupid example from the Old Testament and connected with the Matrix. We have computer programs in our cell phones, in our computers, everywhere. Computer programs are pure rationality, logic, reason, no emotion, no psychosis, no revenge, nothing, no herd behavior. It's logic as logic can be. Even these programs, however, come to a halt. We call it a freeze. Your computer freezes. So you need to restart it. And then, of course, and I'm not giving any excuses, it seems like even a society does that from while to financial markets, other markets, all markets like that. Now, the ancients in the Old Testament, they knew about this. They knew that the system, from time to time, comes to a halt, it freezes, it gets this sort of crunch, the credit crunch. Credit means faith, by the way, in Latin, so you got a faith crunch. That's how we should, also think about the way what's happening. So what they did is once in 49 years, they had the year of Jubilee, and they reset the system in a fair way. So it was a asystematic component of the system, which said, okay, once in 49 years, the rich return the land, at least the land, to the poor, and they set the debts free, and they set the slaves, and they forgive debts. Otherwise, you can keep your things, but you must forgive debts. And every 49 years, they reset it like that. We forgot about this, absolutely. We forgot that the business is going in cycles. What we did as a society, we took part of the cycle, the manic cycle, as a trend. And this is also quite a characteristic of our time. We're not, I think it's a misdiagnosis that we in the West that the economy is depressed. The economy is manic depressed. And that's a huge, huge difference, because to a depressed person, you give antidepressants. In terms of economics, you give them budget deficits. To a manic depressed person, you mustn't give antidepressive, because what you're going to do is you're going to spur another round of mania. And that's exactly what you hear in all these debates, not this one, but the business debates. Basically, sum it up, all the business people are crying for is, please give us back our manic periods, because everything was so much nicer then. The fantasy level with which we view Star Wars is the same fantasy level with which we read and do these models. Let's assume that force exists and that you can choke people with it when they're nasty. Let's assume that light travel exists and lightsabers are really cool when you're a Jedi. And then the whole story makes sense. You know, my father, because Star Wars I love Star Wars, and when I watch it with him, he goes like, no, that's not possible. You can't do that. I mean, come on, that's a stupid movie. And I was like, my father, chill, it's just a fantasy space, okay? But he's right. I mean, my point is that we exercise the same level of fantasy, a little bit different, but it's the same zone when we come up inventing all these sort of models that human beings are rational and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
The perfect market is like a Jedi. It's inexistent, but it's nice to believe in.
Yes. Yes.
There's one major difference is there's no feedback loop between Star Wars and society. And these models are then sort of begin to form and shape the society they initially described. And that's sort of how we're now stuck. I think these models are remodeling our world. In order for our world, we become slave to the model.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. Only I would think that many business people think of themselves as Jedis.
Yeah.
And Aragorns and these sort of undercurrents. They don't talk about it, but they still do. But it's the same. It's a self-creative fiction. So what's the problem today? To answer your question rigorously, or a little more rigorously, is. We make fun of people who believe in myths, of course. You know, Solus once said, which is a pre-Socratic philosopher, myth is something that never happened, but it's happening always. And of course, the old didn't really believe that there's a chariot carrying the sun. They just didn't have anything better to believe in, but nobody really believed it. Today, the same thing happens, only we believe those myths. So, for example, in the morning, two economists meet, and let's say, okay, let's assume that human beings are rational, egoist, and they know what they want. That's a big one also. And they do everything they can to maximize it. It's an assumption. We assume it. In other words, it's not true. It's an assumption. Like when you calculate the free fall of an object, you assume that friction of air doesn't exist. Of course it does exist. We all know it exists, but we assume it away. Why? For one reason only, to calculate it better. Not to understand, but to calculate. So far, so good. But then these two people go into the pub in the evening, the physicist and the economist, and they sit with their philosophical friends, with their theologians, and the economists say, you know what we've learned? We know what we discovered today? That human beings are rational. It would be like if the physicist would say, you know what we discovered today? The friction of air doesn't exist because our calculations are easier because of that. No, it was in the morning, it was a technical assumption, in other words, a myth, nothing else but a myth, just to help us calculate certain things. It has no claim on the truity. But we walk into the pub in the evening and suddenly it has become a theological, ethical, philosophical, anthropological truth about a human being. It's the same difference like saying, let's assume I have 10 million euros and saying I have 10 million euros. There you see the huge difference between the two sentences. But in science, or myth-making, however you want to call it, in economics, we've neglected it. So we are worse than our predecessors because they at least went to the church and realized what it is they believe. And every Sunday they repeated, I believe in, Father and whatever, Son and the Holy Spirit. And they knew it was a belief, so they had it's a belief. Today, we don't believe our beliefs anymore, we know them for fact. So we are more ideological than any civilization before us. We believe the myths that we ourselves created in the morning.